Hi, I'm Josh. I'm in 3rd grade, and I'm going to ring my bell, and my teacher's Mrs. Hurd at village school. This rope is so hard to pull, so my mom's going to help me.
Ready?
Yep.
Good morning. My name is Neil Piper. I'm a member of First Parish Church, and we're virtually welcoming you to the church today to give you a little tour of this historic building and our relationship to the town of Gorham. So hopefully you'll find some things interesting today and learn a few things about our church and the history of town of Gorham. The first thing I'd like to ask is this church is very old, and it's actually not the oldest church in town because we had other buildings that were done before this church was built. But the interesting part is that this church existed before the town of Gorham became a town. And one of the reasons it's called the First Parish Church is the church was established by a grant from the King of England. And the King of England, at that time, all the towns in England were called parishes. So he was calling the town of Gorham a parish of Gorham at that point because it hadn't been incorporated as a town. So part of the reason to get a town established, you had to have a meeting house and a place for people to gather. So the first parish was the first building in the town for the church which is a church cabinet congregated at. So therefore we had the First Parish Congregational Church. And you'll see these all over the state of Maine, especially along the coast, some of the older towns that were established by these grants from the King of England. So that's how we started, and the town became a town by the Narragansett grant, which you may have read about in your history, that was settled because of the grant that they had from the Indian Wars, and the king gave a lot of the soldiers grants of land to settle instead of pay, so they were able to come and settle the area. And that's how the town of Gorham came from some of the early settlers. Also helping me today is Rose Phinney, and Phinney is the name of one of the early settlers, and he was one of the soldiers that were part of that Narragansett group, and he was one of the first settlers in town. So Rose has a long history, as with this church does, with a lot of the founding fathers of the town. This church was one of 3 churches that were established in the town. The first one was on a fort hill, when part of the fort, and then that burnt down a number of years later, and then this church was actually built in 1798. Even though our church was established in 1750, which makes this congregation 270 years old, which is older than the town. And the town became a town after the Revolutionary War started, and we got independence from England, and then we became an official town. So that was part of that. On the tour today, we're going to see several aspects of the town, the clock, and some of the things that the town donated to us, and we're also going to talk about some of the things we have in the church and how church life was back in the early settlement. So the first thing I wanted to talk about now is a little bit about the church itself. If you look at the church, and you can't see it all here now, but if you kind of look around, you're looking at the altar behind us, and that's how it's set up today. Originally, the altar wasn't there. They had a chorus area and a choir area and a organ. But the minister stood way up at the top, up in the balcony area, and talked down to the people. And all the pews actually were sitting the other way around. And the doorway to the church was way over on the street side, or on this side over here. So it was arranged totally differently. The other thing about this church, which made church life a little difficult, was that the minister liked to come in on Sundays and he'd preach for like a couple of hours. So a lot of times the minister would be talking away, and of course it was difficult then because the church wasn't heated. So the people had to sit in their pews, and a lot of time they'd bring a little box with some heated stones in it to keep their feet warm, so while they were listening to this minister. And the minister would go on for a long time. Well, if you think about life back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the people worked 6 days a week from dawn to dusk. So when they came to church on a Sunday and they were listening to someone talk for a long time, they'd quite often get kind of drowsy and they might fall asleep. So the minister had deacons around, or people that would help keep the people focused on what the minister said. And one of the things they would do is they'd have this long pole, because they had these pews that were set up and you reach across, and on the front of each one was a little feather. And they'd go and they'd reach over and they'd tickle somebody behind the ear or on the nose to wake them up if they were falling asleep. So one of the jobs of the people that helped the church was to work what they called the tickle pole and to keep people awake during these long services. This chair is another artifact we have in the church. It actually came from England, and it came with our first minister when he showed up. He was a Harvard-educated minister from England, where all the ministers came from, mostly from Harvard these days. And he came and took his first assignment and brought some furniture with him, and he left this when he left the ministry here. And this chair was actually set by the door of the church, and it was done for a sentry that would sit there. And he would sit there with his sword to keep Indians or animals or other things from coming into the church, because in the summertime they'd leave the door open. They didn't want pigs and chickens that were roaming around outside, because back in those days they didn't have a lot of them fenced in. They'd roam loose around town, and they'd be at the door to hold that, and he'd have a sword. Well, if you sit in the chair and you have a sword, it'd be very uncomfortable to sit square in a chair. So the chair is cornered around in a corner, so it's called the swordsman's chair, and he was the entry to the garden. So that's to the church. So that's kind of how that is set up. And it's still in pretty good shape, and it's very comfortable to sit in. As part of the church, we also have music, and that was kind of important to the early churches, and it still is important to churches today. In the early times, they had wooden organ pieces, and they had these tubes, and each tube was set up with the air go through it, and the wind would pump through the tube to make noise. This is a sample of one of the old tubes that we had with the wooden columns in it to make different sounds, and have bigger ones or smaller ones to make the organ noise. Today we have a more elaborate system, and it's run with electronics, and it's sitting in behind this wall up here, and it's run by a console over there. But this was part of an original organ, and now they still have some wooden tubes there, but a lot of them are metal now and work with electronics and digital part. So that was another part about the church that we won't see today, but you might be interested in knowing about.
This building that we are in is actually the third church. The first one was built on the top of Fort Hill around 1740, and it burned by fire in 1790. And this bench was in that church. So this is a very old bench. Can you imagine sitting in this for 5 hours of a sermon? That seems like a long time, and it's not really awfully comfortable. However, the second church was actually the brick building that's across the street. And at some time around 1782, there was a disagreement between the different members of the church, and about 90 people left the church and built that church. And they did become reunited, and then they had two church buildings, and the one across the street was used as a Sunday school for a long time. When this church was built, it wasn't set up exactly the same way. The main entrance was on what is now the side out there, and the minister was up in the balcony talking down to his people. And the people they had little boxes that had pews in them for the people to sit, and you had a family pew, so you would sit in the same place in your pew each Sunday. And sometimes people brought little foot warmers because there wasn't any heat in the building. Kristen Duchesne made this replica of the church out of gingerbread, and nobody has wanted to eat it because it's too beautiful to taste. There are 6 stained glass windows in the church. Many of them were in the brick building across the street, and when the addition to the church was made, the stained glass windows were very carefully moved over to this church. There are 3 windows here, there are 2 in the sanctuary, and there's 1 out by the old bench, which you will see. And they are very, very well done. They are of museum quality, and they were mostly given in memory of somebody. This one says Jacob Hamlin, Solomon Lombard, the first minister, and you will see, if you look at them, they're all given in memory of different people. There are two more of the stained glass windows on either side of the altar area. This is the sixth window I've been talking about, and I think it's my favorite.
So as we wrap up our tour, I wanted to show you these stained glass windows in the back. And one of these, the one that you're looking at in the back here, was actually donated by a person by the name of Frederick Roby. Now, I don't know if you've learned about that in your history classes, but you probably should know about Mr. Roby. He became governor of Maine, and he was governor from 1883 to 1887. He was the 39th governor of Maine. And he donated that stained glass window shortly after one of his sons died of an injury or an illness when he was only like 12 or 13 years old. And Frederick Roby was important during the Civil War. He was actually the paymaster for Abraham Lincoln, and he paid all the soldiers in New England for pay during that time of the war, and he was quite important to that effort. And he was a prominent member of the church. Another one on the other side, the other one is done by Elijah Baxter, who was the father of Governor Baxter, who was also in the Gorham area and Portland area and very famous in the state. So we have a lot of prominent Gorham people that are represented in these stained glass windows and a history of our community. Our next stop on our tour is a visit to the clock, which is actually the town clock. And this was built in 1857. And actually it was a gift from Toppin Roby, which you may have heard about in your history of Gorham as being a benefactor for many things that were in the town. In this particular case, the town wanted a clock because, as many towns had, a lot of people didn't own watches or owned clocks themselves, and to keep track of the time, this clock was in the middle of town, in the highest spot in town, so they decided the clock would be a great thing. So Mr. Roby went and ordered and bought this clock, which you can see in the background here. And this clock is owned by the town, and originally the clock was way up in the top of the tower, and one of the jobs that the town actually paid a person to do was to be a clock winder. And a person would come here once a week and have to manually wind the weights that made the clock mechanism work. Well, today, when we did the clock over about 15 years ago, they put a motor in there, so that's done automatically now, but the town still maintains and fixes the clock and oils it on a regular basis. And you can see the movement on the right-hand side of that long wooden pendulum, which helps click the clickers that make that thing move a second at a time, and it works that way 24 hours a day. So it's quite a mechanical instrument that was made in the 1850s. So you see they had a lot of skills back then, which made it quite interesting and quite a source of pride for the town of Gorham. And we have mechanisms there so we can change it for daylight savings time and keep it on accurate reading. But it used to be setting way at the top, and they moved it down here in the year 2000. And when they did that, these little columns here used to be where the organ was. And the organ that we had, and the whole organ mechanism had to be moved to the back of the church in a new section to make room for the clock. So it was a major job to get it done. And it created some controversy because the town and the church were supposed to be separate, but the clock is really part of the town, and we had to work out a lot of arrangements to make that work. But we're all glad to have the clock and have it working accurate. The clock face is now 80 feet up in the air, so when you come into the church, you can see how high that is up. That's 80 feet. So it needs to be rewound every 8 days, and it's now using by electric motors and pendulum and gets cleaned once a year.
Ready?
Yeah.
The bell was installed in 1852. It was a gift of Toppin Roby, and it's a Paul Revere bell, which means that it was manufactured in Boston at the Paul Revere Company. And it weighs 1,250 pounds. So it had to be shipped up by boat to Portland, and then by ox cart to Gorham. And then it was put on pulleys, and they had to hoist it up. And in the installing of the bell, there was an accident, and some of the staging gave way, and one man was killed. which was very sad, and happened to be a town doctor, which made it even worse. And there used to be another bell, another rope attached, but we're doing just one, and it's changed the way that the bell is rung, because when that bell that heavy was swinging back and forth, it was causing structural damage, so it had to be reworked, so it's in a better manner now.
Well, as we wrap up the tour, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you learned a little bit about the history of Gorham and about this big church that sits in the middle of town. And I hope it was an exciting and interesting time. It's much better to be here in person, and we miss not having you here, because part of the fun of visiting this church is coming as a group and showing this experience together. But hopefully this visual tour will give you some idea of what you might have missed, and an appreciation for some of the history that we're trying to offer you as our appreciation for the town of Gorham. So watch it, enjoy it, and if you have any questions, please call administration at First Parish Church, and they'd be glad to answer any questions about the church and about things you may have heard here that you'd like to learn more about. So with that, I'd say have a good day and hope to see you soon.
We miss you, Gorham third graders.
Gorham.org #.
From your friends at First Parish.